The non-mainstream press, despite its frequent ineffectiveness, has always been viewed with alarm by the jerks and subhuman filth who run society. Probably there is not a city council in any sizable town, not a university board of regents, not a student council, not a board of supervisors or police chief's office, or any other entity that holds and wields power, has not at one time or another directed its surprised attention to the unlicensed, unauthorized, unapproved, not zoned for small newspaper or handbill or journal that was suddenly criticizing that body. The reaction of persons who have never been exposed to radical or independent publications before is very interesting. They physiologically react as you might imagine someone who was watching flying saucers land. Soon, however, their appalled disbelief gels into a firm conviction that something must be done. Direct, forceful application of censorship or suppression tends not to work, at least in the USA, but it's the first thing tried. After that, more subtle methods are used, both by people who wish there was no small press and by those who only wish they were running it. Here we'll look at only a few of the effective techniques that have been applied. Control by supply. Underground newspapers of the Vietnam era had a typical look or visual style, which was caused by the operation of several common factors. First, despite the incredible, nonsensical version of an underground newspaper office, as shown on reruns of Dragnet, there were usually no clanking letterpress printing machines, no linotypes, no people setting type by hand out of cases, like actual block type movable print. That stuff is time consuming. It's very meticulous. I can attest to this. Undergrounds were printed commercially at regular printing companies, from paste ups, big, big page layups that were done with, just regular Exactos and glue sticks on people's kitchen tables. You got yourself a great big length of like poster board, if you want to spend a little bit more money, you could get some of the slick stuff, right? And it would still take a long time, but this could be done, right? The typical underground office had too many people in it at any one time, too little work actually being done, and printing deadlines that were often met by frantic, last-minute sloppy typing and pasting up. The biggest problem for the underground publisher was simply filling up pages once the piece de resistance or blockbuster expose of the week was laid out. The underground, in other words, was hungry for prefabricated, graphic-laden, and especially typeset articles ready to be plunked down in the gaping holes throughout the newspaper. Well, remember, this is all before the interwebs, alright? This is an actually very old problem for every small publisher, underground or not. And to skip back to frontier days for a moment, we find that the lone editor publisher, having just unloaded his cumbersome press from a covered wagon and lugged it inside piece by piece, inside some unpainted wooden building with a false front, ordinarily could not possibly write, nor typeset for, nor print a whole newspaper on anything like a very regular basis. So hungry for supply, he and others like him constituted a demand, one that was met by agencies that sold prefabricated newspaper insides on sheets ready for the frontier publisher to finish off with his own material. Boilerplate is the word. Tops were left blank in case the editor wished to imprint his own newspaper's name there, but the main task left was still fairly considerable. The main task was to write and set up the outside 2 or 4 pages. This expedient enabled one lone hand to put out a substantial article, but whoever wrote and printed those boilerplate inside pages was exerting massive control over what was being said under the paper's banner. In the case of the undergrounds in the 1960s and 70s, what happened was, at first, extensive borrowing. papers copied at will articles or drawings from others, thus building a spirit of cooperation and solidarity of purpose, though to a degree this also tended to homogenize the contents. What do we see on the interwebs? We see a lot of fucking copy pasta. Because of the widespread use of typewriters for typing the newspapers' directly reproduced columns, publishers usually had their printers reduce the size of the pages photographically when making the plate negatives. So, paste-ups were laid out at sizes according to about a reduction of 60%. Every time you would reproduce those, the photos or drawings would tend to get smaller and smaller as they were picked up by paper after paper, and that would limit the number of successive copying, unless someone on the end of the chain made an attempt to seek out the original. So it's all just a bunch of schrot, and it's just passed on down the line. Into this situation stepped a group of Marxists who founded a service called LNS, Liberation News Service. These were probably people connected to actual foreign communist, actors. To member papers, they would send, about once a week, a packet of prepared clippings on white paper that could either be laid out or photographed intact or completely rewritten. Even if rewritten, the underlying Marxist politics tended to survive into the final copy, and of course, if the copy wasn't revised at all, but merely lifted right out of the packet and slapped on down for reproduction in the paper, the doctrinaire supplier had already full control of what the paper's readership would eventually see. This was more than just writing. Graphic after graphic of triumphant Oriental peasants with fists upraised or storming the gates were in the air. Korean, Vietnamese, Chinese, or Algerian insurgents grimly marching forward in determination together, men and women equally, with machine guns and revolutionary communist banners flying on staves poked up in great profusion. Such artwork set the pictorial tone for the LNS and its member newspapers, and anyone who borrowed from them. The authoritarian content is instantly recognizable as such by anyone who had a consistent analysis. But in those hectic days, they either refused to or they just were too lazy, and they didn't. Most underground people were not political theorists or seasoned observers of social movements. They were well-intentioned opposers of the Vietnam War, the draft, and police brutality. So in other words, they were just spoiled young boomer brats who were reacting. They were reacting according to what they saw as the issues affecting their generation. Can't really fault them for that, though. Nevertheless, the ergot works its way into a big big sheaf of wheat. Even 20 years later, one still then and there notices an old LNS graphic. These days reproduced by photocopier in some small zine or tabloid, now often showing dot rastering that indicates that it has been scanned into and printed back out of somebody's computer. A good example of control by supply happening lately is the identical article reprinted in a number of large circulation newspapers on the thuggish vandals in ninja masks, supposedly anarchists, who are running around and shitting on everything in the Eugene, Oregon area. If they are credible, positive examples of this philosophy of anarchism in action, of course there would probably be no article at all in any paper, and if there were, it wouldn't be reprinted in all the others. They're basically just shitbags who like attention. Some of them are probably the agents of foreign governments. Others are probably just trust fund kids, drug addicts, moochers, just basically despicable human beings. The only official channel for the expressions of citizens is the section of local letters to the editor in the typical American newspaper, and this is ordinarily controlled extremely very rigidly. Either the paper selects letters that will conform to the paper's own editorial brand of authoritarian politics, or it chooses ones that are especially confused and fallacious in order to discredit, by association, all other similarly sounding dissident opinions. So basically, what they'll do, a good example of this is the Minneapolis Star Tribune. They'll only allow the most cucked or confused or just incoherent type people to write in and bloviate and spew in their letters to the editor. But there isn't just one editor. There's many editors, and every last word that gets in there is like it says, just pre-selected for a very specific purpose. Which is why that stuff doesn't work anymore. Anyhow, this was just a sample of something from pre-interwebs days. Written propaganda and stuff like that. Visual propaganda. Important stuff. But that was that was how it was done. And there are traps and snares and pitfalls and obstacles to that. So pulling the strings. How businesses and institutions attempt to control the small press, by the anarchist Fred Woodworth, who I do not agree with, but he definitely touches on some pretty important things that I myself have actually seen. So there you go. Let me know what you think, if you think anything at all.